I want to move on today to something rather different, namely not so much the pattern of fertility and the level of fertility and the trend of fertility, but rather the setting of fertility and more broadly the circumstances under which men and women have lived together in Europe over the last half a century or so, and the remarkable transitions which have taken place over that time. You'll recall that right at the beginning we started talking about the so-called West European marriage pattern and the contrast which that was claimed to have with the marriage patterns of Eastern Europe to the east of so-called Heinel's line, and generally speaking with the rest of the world. Not to say that the rest of the world or east of Europe was homogeneous in any way, not to say that west of Heinel's line was homogeneous. Nonetheless, there were distinct patterns in terms of later marriage, in terms of the nuclear family-based household, which seemed to be rather consistently different and arguably important for the social and economic future of those different areas of the world. Well, things, of course, are now changing. And we have seen in the last 50 years, certainly in my lifetime, an extraordinary transformation, certainly in the setting of fertility, in the popularity of marriage, in the popularity of alternatives to marriage, in conjunction with changes in the birth rate, in conjunction with radical changes in social and behavior attitudes and the behavior which follows from them. And this package of behavior, this package of changing attitudes goes under the heading of the second demographic transition. And the transformation of the West European marriage pattern and the rise of the second demographic transition, its possible journey into universality, according to its proponents, is what I'm going to talk about today. This is one indicator of what's been happening to marriage in Western Europe, using England and Wales as the example. What you see here is the change in the mean age of marriage from 1889 in the far left. Let's get rid of this table. 1889 here up to 2001 over here. The blue line is the mean age of unmarried men at marriage, and the red line is the mean age of unmarried women, then called spinsters, at marriage. As you can see, right into the 1930s, hovering around a mean age of about 25 for girls and about 27, 28 for young men. In fact, if anything, increasing in mean age, so no decay of that aspect of the West European marriage pattern evident at all, right up to the eve of the Second World War. And you can see the unevenness here arising out of the turmoil of the Second World War, followed by this remarkable decline in mean age at marriage, going hand in hand with a huge popularity, new popularity of marriage. 95% of the people born around the time that I was born eventually got married, most unusual in Western European traditions. And then, almost as soon as it appeared, by the time we get to the early 70s, it goes into reverse. And we see this increase in mean age of marriage to hitherto unprecedented levels, to about 30 or so, now over 30 for young men, and approaching 30 for women. Now, 10 years after this graph was drawn, it's gone even higher. And that, of course, has gone not just with a delay in marriage, but also a reduction in the popularity of marriage and a transformation of the whole setting for family life and for reproduction. This is generally mimicked over the rest of Western Europe and also in other parts of Europe as well, even more interestingly. What we see here is groups of countries, the unweighted mean of the average age of first marriage in groups of countries. These are for women. The blue line here is Scandinavia, as always in the vanguard of social change in these respects. Mean age of marriage rising up to nearly 30 for women, higher than in Western Europe. In green here, this is northwestern Europe. That's Britain, Belgium, France, and other countries in that general area, following fairly close behind. Even in southern Europe, something similar has happened. A later changeover, the changeover in Scandinavia started to happen in the 1960s. As you can see, in southern Europe, it didn't happen until the 1970s, but still following very much the same pattern. And more interesting, perhaps, is what's been going on in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union. You'll recall there was this very surprising, perhaps paradoxical fact that communism, supposedly and regarded by many as being progressive, modernizing, updating kind of procedure, breaking old traditions and opening up possibilities for all kinds of new behavior, reinforced the traditional differences between Eastern and Western Europe as far as marriage was concerned. Marriage remained nearly universal. Marriage remained early under communism. It was not, as you might have expected, sort of modernized in being made later and more optional. And you can see here that in the blue line, which is for Central and Eastern Europe, and the purple line, which is the former Soviet Union, that's Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and all that lot, mean age of marriage was actually becoming even younger for women over the course of the 50s and 60s and 70s, right up to the end of communism. So by the time we get to 1989, mean age of marriage was just about 22 for both groups of countries, compared with 26, 28 in the rest of Europe. Once communism evaporated, all that changed very radically, something which we'll come back to later on, because it's a rather remarkable, rapid change. And it's as though a kind of spring were released, and these countries bounced back to the sort of level of mean age of marriage which they would have had decades earlier if they had shared with the kind of patterns which Western Europe had been developing over that time. More on that later. But certainly a major and very sudden transformation. Hand in hand with the delay in marriage is a decline in the popularity of marriage. These are merely numbers, thousands of marriages in England in the UK, from 1951 to 2009. As you can see, all marriages, the line in blue, almost halved, maybe down to about 60% of the previous level. First marriages down to about half of the previous level, and this, don't forget, is in a population which is increasing. So the actual rate is declining even faster than these numbers would lead one to suppose. A lot of these changes, the concomitant reduction in mean age of in popularity of marriage, the increase in the mean age, its delay, its avoidance, the accompanying patterns of cohabitation, of reproduction outside marriage, go under a bundle of patterns, both of behavior and of underlying attitudes, under the heading of the second demographic transition. This is one of the most influential models and ideas in contemporary demography, owed in particular to two pioneers from the Low Countries, Dirk van der Kar and Ron Leestager, of whom we'll hear a lot more. They observed these empirical changes going on of an unprecedented kind in Western Europe, really starting in the 1960s, and developed a theory to explain not only what was happening, but also why it was happening, which is outlined in this graph here. There's this undoubted empirical evidence of these very substantial changes in marriage, cohabitation, births outside marriage, divorce, new patterns of upbringing for children going from one kind of family to another, rather than remaining with their biological parents for as long as their biological parents live, for the most part, replaced by all this cohabitation and delay of marriage and all the rest of it. And as far as they were concerned, also going with the low fertility which followed the baby boom. When marriage became less popular, when the retreat from marriage began in the 1960s, that was also the beginning of the decline of the birth rate from the baby boom peak of a reproduction rate above replacement level down to much lower levels. Indeed, by the time we get to the 1980s, to so-called lowest low fertility, which we talked about before. That is to say, birth rates equivalent to less than 1.3 children per woman, which of course bring with them very strong indications of a population decline and population aging, if they're to be continued. They put this package of, this undoubted package of behavior together with a theory that this was driven by the spread of new attitudes and values in society, which they felt were fundamentally due to the rise of prosperity, to the rise of welfare, to the accompanying increase in secular thinking and higher levels of education, which satisfied had satisfied earlier material needs and enabled people to, as it were, be emancipated and as it were, do their own thing, to think about new ways of behaving, not to be so bound by notions of duty to God and to parents and to peers and to society, but rather to, as it were, emphasize the duty they had to themselves, to develop their own interests, their own inclinations, without quite so much constraint from traditional pressures. A set of attitudes which they described as following Robert Inglehart, rather using the rather unsatisfactory term of post-materialism. Post-materialist values were of the kind which went hand in hand with post-materialist behavior in the form of new ways of family life, new low levels of reproduction. According to the theories of Maslow and Inglehart, which they translated, as it were, into demographic terms, these changes would inevitably follow once a society became educated, liberal, materially prosperous enough to devise welfare systems to insulate people, as it were, from the consequences of their own behavior. And as such, insofar as development, economic development, would become universal, insofar as the development of secular, more educated attitudes to life would go hand in hand with that prosperity. All these patterns would eventually become universal. What was first of all back in the 60s thought to be an innovation of progressive Scandinavians would in fact be something shared in the very, very long run over the whole world. There is certainly some evidence to suggest that this is exactly what's happening. This is the model of the first and second demographic transition. The first demographic transition, starting in the 18th century as far as the death rate's concerned, in the 19th century as far as the birth rate's concerned, showing this marked reduction in the birth rate from a family size of 5 or 6 or 7 down to one of 2 or 3, a preceding reduction in the death rate, an intervening period of population growth in green brought to an end as the birth rate fell to become similar to the birth rate. Then after the beginning of the second demographic transition, these things continuing in ways not expected in the first demographic transition. The first demographic transition was not unreasonably expected to restore a balanced position of more or less zero population growth, which it had started with back in the early 17th century. Or the 18th century. That is not what happened. The natural rate of increase fell to below zero, and as far as they were concerned, stayed there and would stay there. That sub-replacement fertility was a natural concomitant of the emphasis upon personal satisfaction, personal realization of individual needs, rather than the sort of duties which I've been talking about earlier on. That was one aspect of the second demographic transition, which they thought was important. They also felt that an increase in migration, having been negative, emigration predominating in the first demographic transition, to become positive in the second demographic transition. Well, we will see. This is a rather idealized version of the underlying theoretical underpinnings of this second demographic idea. Abraham Maslow wrote a very influential book in 1954 called Motivation and Personality. And he felt that one of the major aspects of human development over centuries was the way in which human society, human innovation had progressively mastered the various problems and needs which affected human beings, taking them away from the kind of preoccupations which were more to do with mere survival, which were shared with animals. The ones at the bottom, in case you can't read it, these are biological and physiological needs, basic life needs: air, food, drink, shelter, warmth, sex, sleep, etc. The daily life of the undergraduate, I suppose, but and not in some respects all that different from the kinds of expectations and needs and desires of any animals and birds outside. Followed by safety needs for protection, security, but more important, order, law, limits on behavior, stability of society, contract and its enforceability, and all the rest of it, culminating, I suppose, in health and safety legislation. leading on to, once those are satisfied, then more humane, as it were, rather than human emotional needs could come to the fore. Needs for family, affection, relationships, companionship, easy friendship with people at work and neighborhood and so on. And leading up to as well, the most important need of all, once all needs were satisfied, once personal security was guaranteed, you could stop worrying about being fed tomorrow, being employed tomorrow, and all the rest of it. Self-actualization became important. You could start concentrating much more on your own personal development, on your unique capacities, your unique ambitions, for so-called self-actualization. This is a very idealistic way of looking at Maslow's hierarchy. As you can see, there's no reason why these shouldn't all happen at once to some extent. But I think you get the point that it's a kind of emancipation of human society from basic worries, moving on, as there are always worries, I suppose, into more personal concerns about self-actualization. This has been put into more empirical forms, more testable forms by Robert Inglehart, in particular in a very influential book called The Silent Revolution, Changing Values and Political Styles Among Western Politics, published in 1977, which has been succeeded by several other volumes exemplifying this idea and providing lots more data for it. Perhaps you've come across it already. He was concerned with measuring empirically, not just the spread of the behavior which I've been talking about, which is quite easily done through demographic and other sorts of information, but also testing the opinions and values which went with it and which allegedly underpinned it. Measured through all sorts of questionnaires which are now universally applied, starting off with the European Values Survey, asking a whole battery of questions about attitudes and values, which has now been developed into the World Values Survey, which is a tremendous resource easily available from the net, showing that the spread of new values, attitudes, or the persistence of old ones in various countries of the world, and embracing more and more populations as time goes on. He devised a rather simple questionnaire to test the extent to which people were traditional, so-called materialist in their value orientation on the one hand, or post-materialist, progressive, more open-minded in the others. And this questionnaire consisted of contrasting pairs of questions, and depending on which of the pair you answered, you will be ticked off, as it were, as more materialist or more post-materialist. And here are the first two simple ones. You were invited to ask whether you preferred the idea of maintaining order in the nation, or alternatively giving people more say in the decisions of the government, fighting rising prices or protecting freedom of speech, maintaining a high rate of economic growth and making sure the country has strong defence forces, or giving people more say in how things are decided at work, and trying to make our cities and countryside more beautiful. I think you get the picture. It has indeed been rather criticised as being essentially Telegraph versus Guardian. And I imagine if you look into your own consciences and see which ones of these you prefer, then it may be apparent how that balances out. Nonetheless, it has been very widely used, rather more questions than this normally, to try and put populations, individuals and countries on somewhere on a materialist versus post-materialist scale. So the more of the blue questions that are answered, the more materialist the person or the population is judged to be. The more green, the more post-materialist, and the more prone to indulge in behavior of the kind we've been talking about. What Van der Kar and Leestager did was to take these notions, the basic notions of Maslow, its empirical and testable refinements by Inglehart and his colleagues, and turn them into a demographic interpretation, such that they felt that those who were more likely to adopt a more post-materialist approach would be those more likely to approve of and indeed participate in cohabitation before marriage. Delaying or avoiding marriage would be relaxed, but having babies outside marriage would not be concerned about the moral, anyway, aspects of divorce, whatever their views might be on the practicalities, and would also take a quotes, progressive, unquote, view about the acceptability of abortion, homosexuality, the presence of foreigners in different countries, and different people from different countries in their communities, and all the rest of it, and vice versa. And this is, to a considerable extent, what happens. Here are some examples which Leestager and his colleagues collected a while ago from behavior and attitudes in Belgium, France, West Germany, and the Netherlands. Quite a large sample of people aged 20 to 29 in your age group. What they did was to compare the values expressed by single men living with their parents, who were scored as 1 in each case, compared with those of the same age who are cohabiting in this column, and those who are married in that column. Here are men and here are women. And you can see that if you look at traditional values like a belief in God, you'll find that the married population is 3 times more likely than the cohabiting population in the same countries, in the same age group, to believe in God. That those perhaps not surprisingly, who are cohabiting are only 1/3 as likely to believe in sin as those who are married. Likewise, differences of praying outside church, and a curious reversal of belief in reincarnation. Now, this is not reincarnation as at Easter time. This is reincarnation, of course, in the New Age form, the sort of rope sandals and lentils and semi-Buddhist notion of reincarnation, held only by a minority of people, but much more likely to be held by New Age enthusiasts who are cohabiting rather than more traditional folk who are married. Interesting also contrast in what's justified, comparing those who are married with those who are cohabiting. So those who think that taking drugs is never justified are less often to be found among those cohabiting, predictably perhaps. Those who feel that cheating the tax man is okay are twice as likely to be found among cohabiting couples than among the married. Likewise, avoiding fines and even fighting with police appears to be thought to be more okay if you're cohabiting, well, at least among the young men of Belgium, France, West Germany, and the Netherlands. Perhaps here too, I don't know. I don't know what you get up to on weekends, but it's not all that common. Curiously enough, certain other aspects of a broadly moral sort are not very different between the two groups. There's general disapproval of littering, of lying, of drink driving. So it's a very particular aspect of behaviour which is contrasted. By no means all aspects, and it would be quite wrong to suppose that the one category is generally, as it were, less moral than the other. Not at all. The empirical evidence for the trends in the total divorce, for the second demographic transition, are pretty unequivocal. And it all really begins in the 1960s. You may know Larkin's poem, where he tells us that traffic congestion and sexual intercourse were invented in 1963. Well, it's pretty much true. This is the total divorce rate in various different areas of Europe. The total divorce rate is a homologue of the total fertility rate. You recall the total fertility rate is the number of babies you acquire over your fertile lifespan as you go. If you experienced the age-specific fertility rates of women at different ages at the same point in time, how many babies would you acquire if things continued as they were? This is the number of divorces you would acquire if things continued as they were in the year in question. And if you're living in the early 1960s, then in most European regions you only have about a 12% chance of getting divorced on current rates. By the time we get up to the year 2000, it's up to 40 or even 50% in Scandinavia and in Western Europe, rather less, rather slower change elsewhere. But all moving upwards. You notice that there isn't in this group anyway any major downturn. It's all going the way that Leestager and van der Kar expected it would go, spreading from one region to another, not necessarily by diffusion, but by the adoption of similar kinds of patterns of behavior, leaving behind the old stability of marriage and moving into a new area of substantial instability and a considerable likelihood that marriages will end in divorce. Marriage in decline. This contrasts two birth cohorts of women, those who are born in 1935, who are of marrying age in the mid-1960s and slightly later, and the 1960 birth cohort, who are now aged 52, who of course grew up in a different sort of era. And you can see on the left-hand side here in Sweden, it's down to almost half of proportion that ever married. Only about 65% of the women born in 1960s have married, and probably even fewer of those whose cohorts are not yet complete. Much less change in Switzerland, substantial change in Finland, Austria, Denmark, France, rather less so in Italy and some of the other southern European countries which aren't on that diagram. Likewise, the trends in the total first marriage rate. The total first marriage rate is another one of these period synthetic cohort homologues of the total fertility rate. That is to say, this is the number of first marriages that you would pick up in the course of your lifetime up to age 50 if you experience the age-specific first marriage rates which were prevalent in the calendar year in question. You may notice something peculiar about this, which may throw doubt upon the validity of the measure. Over here, back in the mid-1960s, we have total first marriage rates exceeding 1.0. Now, it will be immediately obvious, even to the demographically uninformed, you can't have more than one first marriage each, but those data appear to suggest you are. This is a very interesting and good example of the way in which tempo shifts in synthetic cohort period measures can give you inflated results to your analysis. This impossible figure of more than one first marriage per person, these are women, I think, must be women, yes, arises because marriage was becoming more popular and was becoming earlier in the middle of the baby boom. Don't forget, that was when marriage was increasing. And of course, if you're squeezing more marriages into fewer years than previously was the case, you're going to get, if you sum them across different women, you're going to get an inflated figure in exactly the same way as the total fertility rate was inflated by tempo processes here, in just the same way that it's being deflated by tempo processes when things start being delayed and stretched out over time. Anyway, you can see here that from marriage being extremely popular in all the regions of Europe which are represented here, Scandinavia, Southern Europe in blue, Northwest Europe in purple, Central and Eastern Europe in green, red for the former Soviet Union, and orange for the former Yugoslavia, all very popular until the mid-1970s, and this precipitate fall begins later, much later in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union once more, down to quite low levels. Now, on the face of it, this appears to suggest that on these marriage rates, not much more than 50% of women are going to marry in the course of their lifetime, at least up to age 50. And really, if you aren't married by age 50, then the chances are not all that great that you'll marry at all. It certainly got a lot lower, but it's important to remember that just as the acceleration of marriage inflated this rate over here back in the 1960s, so the deceleration of marriage, the delay of marriage, the spreading out of marriage over time is deflating the indicator, and the cohort rates, which are of course not yet complete, do indicate that this is a somewhat pessimistic, if that's the right word, view about the likely future. It's probably going to end up at sort of 60 to 70% ever marrying in most groups of countries, rather than the 50 to 60% which these data indicate. Another interesting point, just to file away, is that there does seem to be a limit to this Gadarene decline into a non-marital state, in the sense that the levels have flattened out since the early 1990s, and there's no significant further decline visible in proportions marrying. So it's much reduced, much delayed, but it hasn't gone away, and more recent data sustain that point of view as well. Here is births outside marriage, another component of the second demographic transition empirical package of new demographic behavior. Starting off back in 1955, you can see that about between 60 and 80 births per 1,000 births were outside marriage. In other words, births outside marriage were sort of 5 to 8% of the total, which is very much an historically similar total to that which you saw in the 18th century, the 19th century. In fact, in the 1950s, proportion of births outside marriage had fallen to the lowest level seen for a very long time, partly, of course, because the advent of contraception made it much easier for those engaged in non-marital liaisons to suppress the consequences of their partnership in a way probably much more important for them than for those who are married. So very low levels of births outside marriage back in the 1950s, going hand in hand with very low rates of divorce, high rates of marriage, a kind of golden age for traditional behavior in this respect. Radically changes, as I mentioned, from the early 60s onwards, particularly fast, of course, predictably, in Scandinavia, Western Europe trailing along behind. Sorry, this is the English-speaking world. This is the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. In this respect, as in others, behaving quite similarly to northwestern Europe and Scandinavia in particular. Western Europe following along, Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union also increasing, particularly after 1989, and the Southern European trend lagging behind, but still pointing in the same direction. So all happening together along with increase in cohabitation. The purple here are the proportions unmarried and ever cohabited among young men and women aged 25 to 34 in various European Union countries around the year 2000. On the left is Sweden and Denmark and France and Finland, as you might imagine. Right over on the right is Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. The usual suspects in Southern Europe, much more resistant to second demographic transition type behavior, although by no means ignoring it, as you can see. And there is an association, although sometimes quite a weak one, between all these behaviors on the one hand and post-materialist values. The post-materialist score is on the vertical axis, and the proportion of the population ever cohabiting is on the right. Not a strong correlation, but there are better examples than that. Well, that seems to be pretty, yes?
I was just wondering, if post-materialistic values are an inevitable consequence of some kind of material level, then how do they explain the fact that some countries are more resistant than others? What do they say about that kind of variation with Northern and Southern Europe, for example?
Well, I don't think Lesarg and van der Kar are not ignorant of the fact that there are important cultural differences which encourage this kind of thinking in some societies and discourage it in others. One of the interesting, you might say that Scandinavia and Northwest Europe in particular were, in biological terms, pre-adapted to adopt these kinds of attitudes because, of course, in family structure, they had been more individually oriented in the past compared with Southern Europe and Eastern Europe anyway, in the sense that much higher proportions of families in Scandinavia and Northwestern Europe, including Britain, back in the early modern period, in the 18th century, the 17th century, the 16th century, were nuclear family-based, where elderly parents were not usually living with their younger adult children and being looked after them. It certainly happened to quite a reasonable degree, but it was not the norm. It was the norm in Southern Europe. And you might expect that under those circumstances, a more family-oriented or familist culture, typical of Southern Europe, typical indeed of most of the rest of the world, would tend to be rather more resistant for all sorts of reasons to attitudes of doing your own thing and ignoring your kin, regarding their opinions, their examples as not very important. it doesn't work so well in Southern Europe or in the Far East, as we will see. Some rather glib objections here that you might say, you might wonder if it was really a second demographic transition, but merely following on from the first in some way. Is it really demographic? Is it really a transition? Does the whole package actually make sense, particularly the question of low birth rate, which I'll come on to in a moment? And also, is it the only way of explaining the radical changes in marital behavior and so on, which we've seen in different parts of Europe? It seems to work better in some than in others. I hope I can show. Nonetheless, as many have said, it remains probably the single most frequently cited and used model of demographic change in Western Europe and the rest of the world at the present time. So it won't do to try and rubbish it too much. Some aspects of this may be regarded as merely the continuation of unfinished business from the first demographic transition, and in part a consequence of it. So some, starting with Cliquet in 1991, have insisted. A more interesting objection, perhaps, is that it doesn't deal with the central issues of demography. It doesn't have anything directly at all to say about mortality and health. It doesn't have anything directly to say about migration, which is now the major driver of demographic change in most developed countries. You may say, of course, that insofar as it correctly predicts very low birth rates, then it may be indirectly predicting high levels of migration as a kind of compensating mechanism. But that would be, I think, taking things a little bit far. and therefore it doesn't have anything to say about population aging or population decline as such. Is it being too nitpicking to ask whether it's really a transition? Perhaps it may be too early to say. Nonetheless, what we have seen is that it's created a huge element of diversity in those countries where it has become more popular, but these behaviors have not completely displaced traditional behavior. For example, even in Scandinavia, the proportion of births outside marriage hasn't much exceeded 50%. It's not inexorably going upwards. You may have noticed in the previous graph that the level was somewhat flattening out. So what's been happening is that in the same countries, in the same populations, in the same communities, in the same towns, even in the same streets, there'll be some people who will be married, some people who will be cohabiting, some people with certain kinds of values, certain people with other kinds of values, and the more progressive ones, if you like, are not completely eliminating the traditional ones. And this is a bit of a contrast, if that remains true, with the first demographic transition. The first demographic transition has become more or less universal, in the sense that almost no one has a family size of 6 or 7, and the average is generally very low. Whereas that kind of convergence is not at community level as well as national level, is not apparent yet in second demographic transition behavior. And this is an example of the variety of preferences for living arrangements. As in the 1990s, things have moved on a bit further than this. But just looking at the top line, preferred living arrangements in Austria, 18% felt that marriage is preferable. Czechoslovakia, as it was then, 64%. Italy, 76%. Netherlands, 48%. That may simply reflect, as Leestager and van der Kar would insist, a different level of acquisition, a different rate of diffusion, and that eventually, in some decades' time, those will be the same and not different. Here's an example of tremendous variety in the United States, as you may possibly recognize. Lost the bottom bit. Never mind. What we've got here is a scoring by Leestager and his colleagues of second demographic behavior, transition behavior at the county level in the US. A very ambitious exercise in statistics. Second demographic transition behavior being estimated by an index made up of the proportions who are reported to be cohabiting and the proportion of births outside marriage and some other variable which I'm afraid I forget. Anyway, those which are manifesting those things to a higher level are coloured blue. The bluer you are, the more likely you are to live in a county where these things are statistically common. The redder you are, the more likely you are to be in a population where most people are married, where births outside marriage are are very infrequent, and all the rest of it. This, as you might imagine, is the great state of Utah, very red indeed. This is the central heartland of you might say conservatism, of the religious right, if one can impose a political notion upon it. And here is the liberal, progressive East Coast and laid-back California, indulging in behaviour very much more similar to that of northwestern Europe and Scandinavia, and also much more similar to Canada up in the north, where behaviour is somewhat different from that in the United States, and certainly very different from this more conservative area here. So much so that some satirists have imagined that the future might look like that, that Canada and California and the East Coast might combine, and leaving the rest to a different way of looking at the world. Interestingly enough, and without wishing to divert too much, this, if I can flip back a second, this contrast here is alleged by some to have considerable potential political consequences. Because while, as we will see, it is not the case that a favour for second demographic transition behaviour in terms of cohabitation and so on goes hand in hand with low birth rates, it doesn't, it's the reverse. Nonetheless, within countries, the lay star of expectation is roughly expected. Those, as might seem reasonable, those countries where you're doing your own thing, where you're putting yourself first, to put it to caricature almost, those values are also the ones where birth rates are low. And indeed, birth rates are low in the East Coast states. Birth rates are low in the non-Hispanic populations of California and elsewhere, and tend to be high here. Insofar as there is a strong religious association there, according to Eric Kaufmann, that's good news for religion, insofar as religion is transmitted from parents to children with a lot of leakage. That will benefit the survival and spread of strong religious values. It will also have political consequences, because these states tend to vote for Mr. Bush and not for, as it were, Mr. Obama. Insofar as political prejudices and political tastes are inherited from parents to children, which they are, but with a very considerable leakage, then it should be that Republicans have got a built-in demographic advantage over Democrats, and in due course the future may be red. Now, there are so many other factors affecting politics that this is perhaps rather a far-fetched notion. It is seriously advanced in some American political science circles. That there is a demographic problem which the Democrats have got to overcome by trying harder, as it were, on the political front. Is this transition? Yes.
With respect to the political aspects of it, if kind of a Republican came into office who maybe imposed top-down kind of laws or that might increase fertility or something, is that kind of it might work? You know, if I'm not expressing myself very well here, but
not at all.
If kind of like laws or kind of abortion laws came in that maybe increased fertility outside marriage, could political changes there change the demographics?
It's by no means impossible, and in authoritarian states, of course, that is exactly what has happened. Romania being the most dramatic example back in 1966. I think in the United States politics that it is inconceivable, if that's not the wrong word, that could happen. Not the least, of course, because although the Republicans tend to be more pro-life than Democrats, generally speaking, nonetheless, there's a very strong American tradition of the state not interfering in various private matters. And I'd have thought that by itself would be the overwhelming factor which would prevent that happening, quite apart from the obvious huge political problems which it would cause. Well, I mustn't pretend to be a political scientist, but that's just my view. I would not pretend it was any better than yours in that matter. Is that a question or a stretch? Okay. Yes, a transition is not meant to be reversible. And again, there's small indications that there is a bit of a rebound going on here in terms of, now this is the total first marriage rate, is actually creeping up a bit in these countries, which I have carefully selected to make my point for me. the increase is not great. Nonetheless, it is there. And we'll have to wait and see if it sustains. Birth rates can go up as well as down, as you will recall from previous lectures. And again, those are a few carefully selected patterns showing a long-term, although slow, drift upwards. There's also the question as to whether all aspects of this transition can be sustainable, particularly in an era of constrained economies, and even more important perhaps in an era where all populations in the developed world are aging, some of them aging very fast, and this is imposing absolutely unavoidable extra burdens upon the economy. One of the ways in which the demographic transition behaviours can be sustained is because they can rely upon welfare. If you've got a welfare cushion which protects you from what in previous decades or previous centuries would have been the very dire economical consequences of having a baby outside marriage, getting divorced, and so on, then of course it opens the field for a wider participation in those behaviours. If economies become constrained and the considerable welfare costs of that welfare support become more difficult to support, partly because of adverse economic circumstances, partly because of competing demands from the older generation, then it may be that the welfare blanket will become more moderated, and indeed there's certainly been revolts in the polling booth against the very, very high taxation required to sustain the welfare state in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries. As you probably know, that socialist parties which have had held sway for 40 years or so in Sweden and Norway have been from time to time thrown out of office in the last decade or more, partly as a result of concerns about the tax costs of the welfare system. It's certainly a coherent concept in the sense that the divorce rate variable, the cohabitation variable, the births outside marriage variable all go together quite demonstrably. Where it doesn't fit is in the very important dimension of the birth rate. International comparisons nowadays show that those countries which have got the most marked manifestation of second demographic transition behaviour, that is to say high births outside marriage, high levels of divorce, cohabitation and so on, are the ones which have got the highest levels of fertility in the developed world, not the lowest, which is exactly what you would expect to be the contrary. Given the importance of self-realization and what some people would call selfish behavior, or self-oriented behavior anyway, which is supposed to be characteristic of the underlying values. If you're thinking about me, you don't want to be lumbered with babies for reasons we've gone into in previous lectures. But, as you see here, the TFR around 2000 is high, close to 2 or even above it in those countries where births outside marriage are common, cohabitation is common, divorce common, Iceland, Norway, France, Ireland, Denmark, Finland, UK, and so on. Very low down here, Italy, Greece, Spain, Switzerland, Germany, and so on. As I mentioned earlier on, statistically speaking, you can't get a TFR of 1.7 or above unless at least 30% of births are outside marriage. That's not a policy prescription, it's simply an empirical observation of contemporary demographic behavior. And that's gone hand in hand with the reversal of the international correlation between women's workforce participation on the one hand and the birth rate over 20 years. The underlying theory is, in some respects, perhaps a little shaky. I mentioned the criticisms made that it's not in any important way different from the conservative progressive axis of social behaviour, which social psychologists have been playing with for quite a long time. As indeed Leestager and van der Kar themselves state, it is in some respects, in underlying fashion, an economic model. The capacity, the freedom of action, as it were, to behave in ways which are described in these various indices, does rely upon a certain level of economic prosperity. Without that prosperity, you go back down the Maslow scale, as it were. You start becoming more concerned with day-to-day survival, more concerned about your standard of living, more concerned with other material things. And indeed, they themselves expected that if there were major economic downturns, then opinion would shift back towards a more materialist approach, at least temporarily. So in some respects, it is not a purely ideational model. Like most of these models, it is related to other aspects of the way the world works and is, in some respects, basically, at base, fundamentally, an economic model and not just an ideological one. Finally, there's the question of whether one can find other explanations for behavior which looks like that of the second demographic transition. In Central and Eastern Europe, for example, there was a temporary huge reduction in standards of living once communism collapsed. The guaranteed wage disappeared, even though it might have been a bit bogus, as the old Soviet jibe was. We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. Nonetheless, there was guaranteed employment, there wasn't any inflation, and a basic standard was assured. That went temporarily, anyway, out of the window once communism collapsed and wasn't replaced by a coherent alternative way of dealing with the economy. And you can see in these fat lines, that's a graph of the real GDP, or real net material product, as it was then called in Soviet times, showing this tremendous dip after 1989 to much lower levels than previously was the case. And these are the births outside marriage in Central and Eastern European countries, Bulgaria, Estonia, Belarus, East Germany, Czech Republic, at the same time. So you see this huge reduction in standard of living happening at the same time as the second demographic transition indicator goes shooting up. That's not what's meant to happen. It's meant to be a result, if it is following the Maslow, Engelhardt, Leistager model, it's meant to be a response to prosperity and security, not insecurity and problems. And that's led many to suggest that one of the reasons why marriage has declined so fast, births outside marriage have increased so much in Eastern Europe is not entirely because there's no second demographic transition, genuine behavior. People nowadays are many more prosperous, but also because in many parts of society there's very considerable anomie, that the Soviet period damaged or destroyed the previous religious-based approach to morality and replaced it with a somewhat some called socialist morality. When that disappeared, then it's left something of a moral vacuum, and that has led to very radical changes which can't possibly be explained in terms of prosperity in Eastern Europe. Here's the number of births outside marriage in various European countries, Eastern European countries, shooting up after that transition. Likewise, we have curious patterns happening in East Asia. It is certainly true that mean age at marriage is going up there from quite low levels. These populations, far east, if you like, of Heinel's line, typically had very early ages at marriage, 20, 21, 22 for women. Those have increased substantially, but that seems to me to be better explained simply in terms of modernization of a hugely educated, hugely successful society, which has overtaken the West in many indicators of survival and of individual prosperity. Oh yes, that's out of place. I'll leave that. It's certainly the case that yes, sorry, and here are proportions of women never married. That too is growing. Previously, a proportion of women never marrying was very, very low. You see among the Malaysian Chinese in 1960, only 3.8% had never married by age 30, 34. Only 2.6% never married by age 40 to 44. And similarly in Taiwan, 1.3%, Japan, 3.2%, all below 10%. Now, by the year 2000, either approaching 10% or even in Bangkok, 20%. Is this simply modernization, that they're delaying marriage and avoiding marriage, and then, or is it part of, because of the much better possibilities for education and career, or is it something to do with the spread of new SDT values as well? The answer to that so far seems to be not much, because these are proportion of births outside marriages, which you would have thought would have gone up likewise if that had been, those had been symptoms of second demographic transition behavior, and they're not. They're still very low. This is births per outside marriage per 1,000, 2 per 1,000, 3 per 1,000, 20 per 1,000, 40 per 1,000, 2%, 4%. I haven't got much data, but this is for Japan, this is for Taiwan, and that's for Hong Kong. So very mixed messages from East Asia. So to conclude, while many aspects of the old West European system have gone, some have remained. Some, like late marriage, like delayed marriage, like proportions never marrying, are becoming common in areas where previously they were not common. So in some respects, it's not dead, but becoming universal. In other respects, it has gone, because the constraint of not having births outside marriage is vanishing, and that such behavior is very, very common and indeed universal. The transition is not complete. It may not become complete, and as I mentioned, we may be ending up with a situation of greater diversity rather than a complete switchover from one sort of pattern of behavior and demography to another. And in some areas, like in Central and Eastern Europe, like in the Far East, second demographic transition models are only one possible example, one possible explanation for what is certainly a very interesting transformation in behavior. And there I must stop. Thank you very much.